Are you a business owner looking for real advice and input? You're in the right place. From concept to launch to growth, funding, and beyond. Welcome to Startup Hustle with your hosts. One once sold a business for $150 million. The other, the author of $1 Million Bedroom. Here are your hosts of Startup Hustle, Matt DeCoursey and Matt Watson.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. 'Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it.
And we're back. Another episode of Startup Hustle. Matt DeCoursey here with Matt Watson. Hi, Matt.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Oh, I'm back for another movie night. How about you?
I'm ready to talk about cars.
We're going to talk about cars, or we're going to talk about Henry Ford?
Both. We're going to talk about both, man.
Well, it's movie night, second movie night ever. First one was Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Little change of pace here. We're going to talk about Henry Ford. Now, why Henry Ford? Oh, that's an iconic American entrepreneur, and I think a lot of people have a impression about Ford. Some of it probably true, some of it probably not. But tonight's movie night is American Experience, Henry Ford. Now, American Experience is a series that PBS did.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just, they have a whole bunch of it, but Henry Ford in general. So I don't know, where do you want to start? Should we start with the history of Henry Ford?
Well, so I think a couple things. So for those who are listening that want to watch this, I think it's important to note that the only way you can watch this is on iTunes. It's not on Netflix or Hulu or none of it. It's only on iTunes.
Yeah, and that was
you can rent it.
Something. Yeah, now when we did our first business documentary thing, that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
But it was out there. Now before we get too far into this, Matt, I should probably let you know that today's episode of Startup Hustle is brought to you by Fullscale.io, helping you build a software development team quickly and affordably. So, how about that new intro to the show?
Oh, it sounded great.
I know. The guy reading it is clearly some kind of Morgan Freeman or voice talent, right?
So before we get into this, what did you think or know about Henry Ford before you watched this?
So that's where I was kind of going with stuff. So, I think that everyone thinks of Henry Ford as this brilliant American good guy. And, like that he invented the assembly line and all this stuff. And, really, and what I really appreciated about this show was it didn't just fluff up Ford. I mean, it really spent a lot of time focusing on, well, the downside. The guy was kind of a hater.
He was a racist, egotistical, fucking asshole.
Yes. And that's the thing. And that's what I thought was pretty interesting about this. And, we'll get into that, but let's start with Ford. So, Ford, he grew up on a farm in basically nowhere.
Yep.
I mean, he was more or less kind of like that proverbial dirt farmer. He was expected to be a farmer growing up. He was considered to be a bit of a boy genius. He, like I said,
he was very much a mechanic.
Yeah, and they noticed pretty early that he was good with the machinery, and he found it to be really interesting. And as he grew up, his parents kind of pushed him towards that, and then sent him to live with his aunt in Detroit at 16. They were kind of like, "Hey, man, you're probably not going to be a farmer. Go find your way." You would talk about things being different. When I was 16, I was just like trying to get a car and like trying to like meet girls and like play sports in high school and maybe graduate. I wasn't like being sent off to a major city to like begin my life's work. But that was the way it was back then. And that was, so they sent him to live in Detroit. And, amidst that, he went to work. He became an expert machinist.
He went to work for Edison, which is the same medicine that we know that helped create electricity and all these different things. Yep. And he worked there for probably 10 years or so before he...
he was at 31. He was a chief machinist for Edison Electric. And and that was in the late 1800s.
Yeah, 1896 he started his first company.
That's when you were still a young boy, right?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. I know you have a lot of experience. So, but yeah, and yeah, that was back in the day, that was kind of how you did stuff. You went and you got experience working for the trades. Now in the 1890s, the car was a luxury item. It was only for wealthy families. It
It
wasn't something that was super attainable.
it was the horseless carriage.
True, true.
And
So
his dream was to create one for the everyday person they could afford.
yeah, and so the issue, one of the things that we've spent so much time talking about the fact that a good entrepreneur and a good business solves a problem. Well, the problem that Ford really saw was that there was a severe mobility
Right.
problem for rural families
Right.
and those communities, and it was a major undertaking to sometimes even just like travel to the farm next door. And
Yeah.
there weren't roadways, highways, byways, and that kind of stuff. The way that we kind of take that for granted.
Yeah.
Like, Matt, if I want to come over to your house, I drive down a very well paved, well lit, smooth road. I don't have to go through. I believe that on most days my car will make it with very little effort or thought, but that certainly wasn't the issue. And now the reason that was a problem is because rural communities were producing food and stuff like that. So it wasn't very efficient. So couple that with the fact that cars were only for wealthy families. And like you said, it gave Ford a desire to want to build a car that he could afford. Now, you mentioned the horseless carriage, and we'll get to that. But, in these first 31 years or so, Ford really started developing this dislike for wealthy people.
Yeah, that was another big theme of the whole show is
Yeah.
he didn't like investors, he didn't like wealthy people, he didn't like any of that. He was very much a farm boy, just through and
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
in his
Yeah.
roots.
So here we go. June 4th, 1896. And Ford drove his first, quote, horseless carriage through Detroit. It actually wasn't even the horseless carriage, Matt. He called it the quadricycle.
Yeah. Yep.
And
It
it
looked
had
pretty
a top,
cool.
except for it had a top speed of 20 miles an hour, had no brakes, no reverse, and it was prone to overheating.
You know what? I would love to have one of those just to cruise around the neighborhood with my kids though.
Except for you wouldn't be able to have any brakes.
Well, we can fix that part of it.
You could only go and no reverse.
That's
So
fine. That's fine.
yeah, but imagine that. Imagine that. So you talk about just like weird shit and the things that you take for granted. I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I was like, okay, 20 miles an hour doesn't sound that fast. When you don't have brakes, that's real fast.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like out teaching my daughter how to ride a bike, and when I was a kid, what was a helmet, right? They certainly were not safe. They weren't wearing helmets. I doubt there was a seat belt in it.
Yeah.
So his friend was basically running in front of him whenever possible to stop traffic, or at that point that would have been horses.
So Henry
Or people,
Ford
get out of the way. Yeah.
was trying to create a Power Wheel.
Yeah.
He invented the
Yeah.
first Power Wheel. Now our
Yeah.
kids all have Power Wheels.
So you talk so here they are, and this thing, you say prone to overheating, that meant it might have run for just a few minutes,
Yeah.
and now we have to sit there and wait for it to cool down.
Yeah.
And now I think we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, some of the things about Ford that weren't super desirable. One of the things I noted that I wrote down while watching this was Ford he carried himself confidently. That was something that was always known. He operated with a high level of confidence. He wasn't insecure. And some of that later kind of got out of control, but it was in 1899 when he started the Detroit Automobile Company.
Yep.
And it was 13 people. So, and you think about that, 1899.
And I wrote down here at that time there were about 57 other companies in the United States trying to build cars.
Yeah, and now the first cars rarely ran for more than a few minutes.
Yeah.
Back to that reliability problem. And that whole thing is I mean, all right. So in 1899, you're looking at a completely different reality. I mean, there were horses everywhere. There weren't
Yes.
any cars,
There weren't a lot of big
you know,
cities.
but here were some of the issues with that. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't give perspective to. So horses are your major mode of transportation. People are riding horses everywhere. What's something that horses do that cars don't?
Shit.
Yeah, and pee. And like everywhere. And a horse, like, so at this point, the cities had a big problem with that. And then another thing is sometimes, what's another thing that a horse does differently at the end of its career than a car?
Dies.
It dies and then rots
Yeah.
in a different kind of way. So here you are in major cities, and like, so here you've been riding this horse to work every day, and for whatever reason it keels over and dies. People just leave it. And you think about that, and think about going, all right, so we're here in Kansas City. Think about going downtown. You're like, man, the horse shit is just really stinky today. It's 100 degrees. You have pee and poo baking all over the street, people trying to pick it up. And I don't remember what the numbers were, but I saw something that in the height of horse usage in New York City, horses were pooping like 1,000,000 pounds a day.
Wow. And by the way, this
Dude,
horse had a
nuts.
name.
That's crazy, right?
My horse's name was Satoshi.
Oh, yeah, we were
That's my horse's name.
I think that was a mini horse that we were going to buy with Bitcoin that we mined, and then we quit mining Bitcoin. So, okay, so here they go. They start their company. Ford immediately has disdain for his investors. He
Yeah.
didn't like it. He didn't like having partners. He didn't like having people tell him what to do. They wanted him to make cars for rich people.
Yep. And he didn't.
And he didn't want to do it. So much like a lot of situations where investors don't feel secure with the money that they've put in, they pulled their support.
Yep. It all blew up.
Yeah. So and that's when the despise for the wealthy got really, really juicy for Ford. He swore. He said after they pulled out, he's like, I'm not doing this again. So he was at this point kind of trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do, and he wanted to make a name for himself. So what better way than to have a race?
Oh yeah. Here we go, baby.
Yeah. Yeah. So you talking about the time frames and the differences here. So in 1901, at this point, Ford took on a famous race car driver in what was Michigan's first car race.
Yeah, and can you imagine though, living in this life where you see horses every day and you never see cars, and then you see these like cars from like the Fast and the Furious all of a sudden show up to do a race? Like, this would be really cool, right? And like everybody,
except for they didn't quite look like that, but
but
sure.
everybody came out to watch this. Like, it was a huge spectacle.
Yeah. So, and exactly it was exactly that. It was a spectacle. Ford won the race, and he had built his own car for this, and that made him a local hero.
And
it was a big deal.
I think technically the other car overheated and died.
Probably.
But
it was
But a big part of it then was the quality of the engine and the range. Like, being able to build a quality engine that could run for 30 minutes or something was actually a huge challenge. And so maybe he didn't have to build the fastest car. He had to build the most reliable engine. And that's all it took to win the race.
Yeah, and anybody that is a fan of racing or any of that stuff knows that often, the win and the loss doesn't always. Obviously it occurs on the track, but the time that you spend in the pit.
Yeah.
How fast can they change tires, add gas, fix this, it's agility.
Right. Yep.
It's automotive agility. And but then that was a big deal. Like, slow and steady might have very much won the race.
Absolutely.
So here comes Ford, and now he's picking up a name for himself. And, he ends up with, they end up eventually building a car. It's famous, maybe the first of it was certainly the first of all famous cars. It's the Model T, man.
Well, I think they built a few cars before that.
Right.
Before the T.
Right. And that was because they were trying to get it right.
Yep.
And then they started to get it right.
Yep. They kind
And
of
that was the Model T.
perfected it with the Model T. And I wrote down here, it had 8 horsepower, I believe, and it only weighed 1,200 pounds. It could drive 40 miles an hour. But probably the most important thing of all of it is it was very easy to repair and very reliable.
You know, one of the things too, and we've talked about this, is get good at one thing.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the Model T, while at first was available in green, later it was available in any color you wanted as long as it was black.
Yes. Yep.
And you know, the thing with the Model T was, you know, it's a $500 car.
Yeah, I wrote down here.
And that was the main thing.
I wrote down here, at that time, average cars were $2,000, and when this launched, it was $850. So maybe the price came down afterwards some.
They got it down around
Yeah.
$500 is where it really started to come out. So, you know, as the Model T came out, there's a whole lot that, you know, and this is where we start. You know, at this point, we're moving on. We're getting through literally the 1900s. And, you know, at this point, Ford had married. He had a son. His son's name was Edsel. Another well-known Ford. And he put his son to work on the factory floor. He didn't give him any favoritism.
Right.
I mean, almost to the point, we'll get into that a little later, because that's where the kind of egomaniacal Ford starts forming. But you know, it was in 1910 that Ford had moved their production line to Highland Park, which is a suburb near Detroit, and their goal was to produce 1,000 Model Ts a day.
Isn't that crazy?
So 1,000 a day, that's their goal, that's their desired output, and they had to figure out how to do that. Now, at the time, there was a lot of people that, you know, at the time they would make a car, and okay, Matt, if you and I were working together at the factory, you and I would put the car together more or less from beginning to end.
Which takes a whole lot of parts to be sitting in one place in one room to go find.
And it also takes a worker that knows how to do a whole lot of different things.
A lot of steps, yeah. I wrote down here it took 12 hours to build a car before they built the assembly line.
That still seems pretty fast.
Yeah.
But with that meant you would have had to know how to do brakes, you have to know how to do motors, you have to know how to do, you know, a lot of different things.
Yeah.
They didn't have the automatic transmission yet, but
Yeah,
so there's
I was going to say, I think he figured out that it was, you know, more efficient to build some of the smaller components, right? And then bring in those completed components. And I don't remember if it was the starter or what it was, but there were some other components that
it was the magneto.
Yeah.
Which was a part of the starter.
Yeah.
That was kind of like the alternator of sorts.
Yeah.
And, you know, so they had a meeting and they sat down. It's, you know, this is an interesting thing is, you know, Ford gets credit for inventing the assembly line. It wasn't actually the case. As they had a meeting, they had brought up the process that was used in meat production.
Right.
So like apparently in meat production, the carcass of the cow kind of rolls down the line and all right, someone's cutting off steaks, someone's cutting off this, someone's cutting off that. And that's what they used for their first model. And it was they used that assembly line process to build these magnetos,
Yep.
which is what started the car. And their production time went from 20 to 13 minutes. Wow. And that, you know, that was a big big improvement. So later they tried it on transmissions, axles, and engines.
Yep.
And, you know, and that's when they really started popping on the assembly line. Now, at that point, they got things moving to the point that Ford actually controlled 50% of the entire car market.
They went from 12 hours to make a car to 1.5 hours, and they could not build these things fast enough.
Well, but they had a problem with that, though. Then this is a big part in where Ford's storyline, both as a hero and then later as kind of a shithead, started. But you know, so the assembly line process opened up employment to more people, because like we talked about earlier, you didn't have to be a specialist at anything, but they had people would show up and they would quit after like 2 days. They hated it. It
I
was just like, over and over and over, just the
Yeah.
same shit
I
every
wrote
day.
down here he had to hire 1,000 people and only would retain 100 of them that
Yeah,
would stay and
yeah,
do
I
the
have
job.
that in my notes too,
Yeah.
because like that really stood out to me, and I was said major problems with turnover to 1,000 hires
The big thing
to
that they
keep 100
did
people.
is they removed the necessity of all skill. You didn't need any skill at all. None. No skill to build a car. Because, like, hey, your job is to screw in that bolt every minute. There'll be another one come by, you screw in that bolt. You don't need to know about
But you
anything
have
else, screw in
you
that
have to
bolt.
think about why that's a major problem, because now if you're in this day and age, in 2020, if you're like, "Hey, I need mechanics," or "I
Mhm.
need someone with that," you have people like how many people do you know that grew up working on cars with dad or doing different stuff? That wasn't an option.
No. No, of
I mean, the
course not.
car was this was new tech. No one had this. This was like something that
I mean,
kinda like remember when the
100
personal computer was just a fad at one point, right?
I think 100 years later, nobody knows how to tune a carburetor. Like,
That's
nobody.
probably because they're run by computers, but sure.
But, that was the problem with my first car is I could never tune the carburetor and get it to work the right way. But, yeah, there was nobody that knew how to fix this shit. Nobody.
Yeah, so here they are that, they're getting things moving, but dude, if you have to hire 10 people to keep one, that's expensive for a lot of reasons that people, even if they're unskilled,
Yeah.
there's still training, there's onboarding, there's hiring. You got to go through that whole thing. So Ford went to his board, and this was controversial. In 1914, they went to a $5 a day wage because
Yep.
they wanted to reduce turnover, and they were going to reduce the workday from 9 hours to 8. But wait, Matt, there's more. They were going to offer some profit sharing.
Yep. And so that minimum wage, I
You know,
think, doubled what most people made.
yeah, they were like barely over $3.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that, dude, they were the board, the investors, the C-suite, everyone. They were like, "This is going to bankrupt this. You're going to ruin this company. This is the end.
Yeah.
We're going to die." And then 10,000 people showed up
Mhm.
ready to work. Think about that. 10,000 people. That's about half of an arena in most big cities show up ready to work. And these people they were so eager to work because they were like, "Oh my God, I never thought I'd be able to make this much money. $5 a day."
Well, and so let's talk about that for a minute because this was really one of the biggest moments in change of like the industrial era of the United States, right? Where it talked a lot in the movie about how kind of before this time, people were producers. They worked on a farm, they made things, they manufactured things, whatever, right? And then around the turn of the century, around this time, partly because of all this manufacturing and other jobs and stuff that were going on, people started to become more consumers. And I think what Ford was after is, my own employees can't afford to buy one of these cars. And my goal was to make a car that everybody can afford. And so,
Yep.
you know, they were starting to pay people a more higher living wage. And that's really what created this whole new generation of people that were really consumers that could afford to buy stuff. And now we live in this world where people buy like endless amounts of shit they don't need, and it's gone way too far. But that was a huge change at this time, in the late 10s, early 1900s. There, big change in our world.
Yeah, and the thing is like $5 a day. That was a big, like, once again, that was a big deal, and that enabled people to buy more stuff and buy more things and potentially even buy themselves a car. Now, amidst all of this, yeah, obviously Ford's really picking up, and they're making some money at this point. Henry Ford he became a bit of a master when it came to controlling the narrative. He was one of the first media influencers.
Yeah.
He was really considered to be the king of self-promotion. And you talk now, there weren't a zillion forms of media. They actually more or less made their own movie studio.
Yes.
And when you would go to a movie, then it might be like the whole movie might be how Ford makes a car.
It was so funny because your daughter's probably old enough. Does she probably watch like dumbass YouTube videos of people doing dumbass
Yes.
things?
No, they're just like kind of like kids playing with
Yeah,
toys or like
this is I
unboxing or
think
something. Yeah.
Henry Ford was the
Yeah.
first person to do this.
Yeah.
It was him
Yeah.
just doing dumb shit like fishing or hunting or playing cards or whatever, and then they would show it in the movie theater.
Now, keep in mind, and like I said, that was different. Now you go to, now you're trying to go see the opening of Frozen or
Yeah.
something like that. But movies were also pretty new back then. So Ford was presenting himself as this like unchanged by wealth and success. He
Right.
was, here I am. Look, I'm just I'm just a farm boy. I go hunting, I go fishing, I do any of this normal stuff. But what was going on off the screen was Ford was not driven by cars. He was started becoming driven by his own ego.
Yeah. Yep.
And now we're so saturated with media from a gazillion different sources. When there's only a couple forms of media and you're dominating one of them, not only dominating, you own it, you're distributing it, that could be a problem. Now, Ford's case, he was really opinionated. This guy was racist. He was anti-Semitic.
Oh, yeah.
He was very vindictive and judgmental of people's lifestyles and the
He
choices they make. He didn't drink. He didn't
No.
smoke. He got up early in the morning to work out. And if you didn't do it his way, to hell with you.
He did some things that were kind of interesting, that I wrote down. I don't know if you remember this, but he, they tracked down a lot of their own employees and wanted to know how they lived and all that stuff, and
Right.
wanted to make sure that they had a proper lifestyle, and I guess they would be reliable employees and all that, but also worked very hard to teach them English, kind of Americanize the employees. I guess a lot of the employees were probably immigrants that didn't speak English. And it was kind of a interesting like social working that was going on of like
Well, I have notes about that. I put Ford became controlling of his workforce by creating a sociologic department
yeah
that kept tabs on workers, demanding that they conform to standards and norms that met Ford's standards. So they would basically, now look, sociologic department basically means a bunch of fucking private detectives
right
that were following people around. They were like following. They would come and all right. All right. So let's just say we're hanging out with the family, and all of a sudden, knock on the door, and it's Ford's sociologic department
yeah
because they want to come in. They want to see if you're living clean, if you're drinking, all these different things. And there was a one strike policy.
yeah yep
So like, well, maybe a two strike because the first, if you weren't up to the standards,
you got a warning.
they would basically you got a warning, but you better get your shit together because these standards are strictly enforced. And here's the thing: is this is absolutely insane.
Yep.
By today's standards, this is outrageous.
I mean, there were some
Like
things that were.
outrageous.
I think he had the right intentions, and I think there were some things that were good about it, like trying to teach people English and some things like that. I think he had the right intentions, but like most like over generally kind of very liberal policies, like it's like the government is in control, and
Sure.
and that's kind of what happened. Like it was like the Death Star, and everybody kind of reported to the Death Star, and
Yeah, but see, that's problematic because one of the things in sociology that they teach you is who watches the watchers.
right,
And that's like the most fundamental part of certain types of like governmental control or whatever, whether it's the NSA or something like that. And the thing is like if you give people power to control the way other people act, think, or behave, eventually it gets out of control. I mean, there's really no example in history, like in all of history, where that hasn't been the case. And that's the thing is it removes an element of freedom. So, and like I said, these are strictly enforced. So what you mentioned, Matt, was they had this like Americanization type, you had to do it. So at the time, and this is a little foreign to what we're used to now, but keep in mind in like 1915, pretty much everyone coming through was an immigrant.
yeah.
Now, now we'll be like, well, what's your nationality? I'm a fucking American, man. My great grandmother was from Ireland. I have not been to Ireland. I am not Irish. I grew up in America. I'm from Kansas in America. I am about as American as it gets in that regard. Now, but they wanted to kind of wash that out a
Yeah.
little bit. Now, like you said, it was with the best intentions, but they have this just weird ass thing. So keep in mind, like, so in a multicultural feel like that, you'd have people from all over. They're dressing different. They're speaking different languages. He wanted to assimilate.
Yes. Yep. Very much.
And they even had this thing, this melting pot
Yes.
ceremony, where when they would graduate, they would walk into this giant cast iron pot. They would show up dressed like they would have in their native country, and then they came out with like
Looking like an
a
American.
fucking top hat
Yeah.
and like I was like, oh my God. Like, I mean, it really was kind of textbook assimilation, but hey, but that was the way it needed to be. Now, here's the thing. There was no workplace standards.
No.
You couldn't tell people not to do that. You could literally show up at your employee's house and be like, I don't like the way you're living. And if you don't change it, get the fuck out. And by the way, that's crazy. That's crazy.
So do you want to get into all that part of it now? Or do you want to save that?
I mean, well, kind of, because here's the thing is during this time, so you talk about controlling the narrative and presenting yourself. So Ford's still presenting himself as this like country boy, this like, with these rural ideals, but he'd become very famous. And meanwhile, is buying a 1,300 acre island where he built a 31,000 square foot home.
Wow.
That's that's a castle.
Yeah.
I mean, 31,000 square feet, dude. That's huge.
Well, he also built this thing called the Greenfield Village, which was like the old school town where he rebuilt like a whole historic town that was like his little playground. That was pretty crazy too.
So here's the thing is so this is where Ford gets kind of nuts. So he, all right, during this time, during the same time, Ford started kind of once again becoming embattled with his investors, and two of which were the Dodge brothers, like Dodge Cars.
Yep.
And I can't remember what their names were, but so at this point, Ford's really popping. He's making money. He's got all these things. He's kind of still doing his media stuff and controlling these employees. And at 55 years old, he announces he was leaving the company and he was going to leave Edsel in charge, who, by the way, at the time was 25 years old.
Yeah.
And at this point, they had $250 million in revenue, which in 19, whatever that was, dude, that's a shitload of revenue. And they had 45,000 employees. And here's the 25-year-old kid. And they're like, hey, man, you're in charge. And now it gets better because 2 months after that, Ford announces that he's going to just go start a different company. And he wanted to build a $300 car and planned on nationwide factories and 200,000 employees. Here's the thing. He never really planned on doing that.
No, but he scared the shit out of everybody.
He scared the shit out of all of his investors. They freaked out. Now, dude, you couldn't do that today either. Elon Musk gets fined for making a statement on Twitter about Tesla, but back then he'd be like, you know what? I'm starting my own company. You guys are all fucked. Your shares are going to zero. I'm going to build a $300 car. I've got the name. I've got the money. You don't have shit. And all it was a trick to buy back his own stock. He spent $106 million. And then once again, the Ford family controlled the company in full. Pretty amazing. You look at some of this stuff, and that's what I said. It's like, okay, so before you watch this, you think Henry Ford. You're like, oh yeah, man, that's like one of America's great entrepreneurs. This guy's doing some snaky shit.
Yep.
Not only to his employees, to his investors, to everyone. But here's the thing: the worst of it all, his own son. He was not cool to Edsel.
No, he was a horrible, horrible father to Edsel. And
terrible.
The show talked a lot about how, Henry grew up as this farm boy, but Edsel very much grew up with the elite of Detroit.
True.
And had a completely
Ford hated that. Henry hated that.
Had a different, very different upbringing because of that. And you actually see this a lot in entrepreneurs, in families. Like, somebody like me, I do something and whatever, but then your kids and your grandkids become very different because they grew up with like a silver spoon in their mouth or whatever, right? And that's where Edsel was. He didn't grow up on the farm. He grew up as this rich kid in Detroit with highfalutin everybody going to the best schools, the best colleges, the best of this, And it was a whole different world, and that created a big divide between him and his father as well.
Well, I think a lot of businesses and the people that started them want to pass them down to their own family, and those businesses fail a lot. And that's
Yeah.
just because of the reason you said, because kids aren't their
The
parents.
work
And
the work
what
ethic
you were
that
passionate about, your kids might not
Yeah,
be.
the work ethic that Henry Ford had, his son isn't automatically born with it.
Yeah. So, all right, this is where it gets bad. All right. So, man, I didn't even realize this was the case with Ford, but this is shitty stuff. So, in the 1920s, he bought a local publication,
Yep.
and I didn't write down what it was. And he started publishing anti-Semitic articles.
Spe
He literally bought a newspaper so he could, and it became worse and worse
He
to the
hated
point that
Jewish people. He thought that
he
Jewish
was
people were the scum of the earth and the problem of
the
everything.
with everything,
Yeah.
right, so no, I mean, it was one thing to have that shitty opinion, it was another thing when he started circulating copies of this paper to more than 7,000 of his car dealers. By 1926, he had a 900,000, circulation newspaper running, and to the point it was so bad that, like, leaders, including Woodrow Wilson, the former president of the United States, were openly condemning Ford for his
You
actions.
know, so everything he did was about all that part of it was horrible. But on the flip side, that might have been like the only nationwide newspaper.
It could have been at some
That
point,
part of it might
but
have
that was
been fairly innovative
yeah,
because he
yeah.
distributed it through the Ford dealerships. But obviously what he
Now
was writing about was very
keep in mind when they have that big of a market share and you're a dealer of that, and here comes this stack of papers. I bet those dealers were afraid to not put those
Oh,
out.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
And just like really, I mean, bad stuff. I mean, Ford actually they got in some trouble later. It came up like, are you a Nazi supporter? Like, it was not what most people would think of when it came to Henry Ford. So, while he's messing around with that, and you mentioned like he's doing his like highbrow rich stuff, he's on that 1,300-acre island. He would buy up like historic buildings, like wherever Edison or wherever the light bulb was
Mhm,
invented, went and bought that building, had it transported to his property and rebuilt. He's
mhm.
like literally like reconstructing, like, I don't know. It's like, there's a place when I lived in Indianapolis called Connor Prairie, and we used to go to it. And it's like one of those recreation villages
Hmm.
where you go in, like all the people are in
Yeah,
character. You're like, where's your refrigerator? Like, what's a
that's where
refrigerator?
Henry lived. He
Yeah,
spent a
he
lot of
built
his
one.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't want things to change, which is a bad way to be an entrepreneur because as time passed, well, so did Ford's innovative ways. Now he's got General Motors gaining market share. Ford at this point is refusing to make any changes to the Model T. He's going, it's a perfect car. It's a perfect car. We don't need to change. We don't need to do anything. So stop asking. And if you ask, I'm probably going to throw you out of the office. And during that period, Ford lost 50% of their own market share.
Yeah, I think they only built the Model T for something like 16, 17 years or something like that. They made
That's a long
they
time.
made 15,000,000 of them, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, but part of the problem, and with movie night, we want to talk about some of these entrepreneurial lessons. Ford surrounded himself by yes
yeah,
men.
that was the problem. And he
And no one was telling him the truth until finally Edsel was taking a stand and was like, "Hey man, like this is not going the right way." But Ford felt like he knew what was best for the public.
Yeah,
Like
that's the
back
thing.
to the distribution of papers, the production of everything. And like Matt had just mentioned, in 1927, the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the line. And with that, they finally retired the Model
He
T.
didn't care what the customer wanted or what the customer's opinion was. His opinion was,
Yeah.
"I built the best car there is in the world, and you're gonna love me
I
for
know
it, and
what's
you're gonna
good for
buy it, and
you.
I know what's good for you."
Yeah. I know what's good for you not only as a consumer, but as an employee
Yeah,
or just as a general
it's
citizen in
very
life. And
socialist kind of views.
it's also, it's
Yeah.
egomaniacal. I mean, just that whole belief. So they finally came out with the Model A, which had a powerful engine, and it actually came in more colors than one.
And it was a huge success.
Yeah. Well, one of the big things they did that was back to being a little more innovative, and they offered an installment plan.
Yes.
The very first car payment, baby.
Yep.
or one of them, which is very uncommon at the time. And, fortunately for Ford, the Model A revived their sales.
Yes.
So, but in the background, okay, first off, it was Edsel that was behind the Model A.
Yep.
And then Ford stepped up and took all the fucking credit
Yep.
for it, and then held a deep contempt for his son for pushing those changes. So now, amidst all of this, this is what you mentioned the Death Star earlier. Ford was building his. He was building this River Rouge mega plant.
Yes.
And River Rouge was an area near Detroit. Dude, at 10 years of construction, and now they wanted to create 10,000 cars a day.
Yes.
Dun, 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 dun.
Does that place still exist?
All right. I think, well, I don't know what in Detroit exists. It's kind of been dynamically changed over the years. But here was one of the things. Now the Great Depression was kicking in. The market crashes. We're in 1928. And up until that point, Ford had been forced to relax some of these sociological department standards and stuff like that, because they got up to having 45,000 employees. Like, think about that. If you're trying to get people that are forcing, I don't know, you'd have to have a whole nother 10,000 employees to probably keep up with the 45,000. But as the Depression years came back, so if you had a job then, your biggest fear was losing it. There weren't a whole lot of other options. So Ford brought back the strict workplace standards.
Yes.
And he kind of pushed it again. And, once again, as time went by, so Edsel was not like that. Edsel was basically the opposite and embraced a more modern form of management, employee friendly, just like good workplace standards. And Henry started looking down on him even more, man. And like you mentioned as well, Henry really, really, really got salty about his Edsel's personal lifestyles and choices, because Edsel lived like the other rich elite.
Yes, absolutely.
But here's the thing. What else was he going to do? Like, he's this famous kid of this famous person, and it wasn't like he was just out with everyone else. So, I mean, you kind of learn to adapt and be like the people that are around you. But yeah, so I mean, Henry at this point, it's like, God, I could not imagine being that dude's kid, because he would just shit on anything that Edsel did or wanted. There was even one point in there. Do you remember the point that Edsel wanted to build another building next to their old factory? So they started digging the foundation for it. Henry shows up and says, "What the hell are we doing?" And he's like, "Well, we have to build another building for this." And Henry's like, "No, that isn't the case." They go to start filling in the hole. And Henry's like, "No, just leave it there." Because he literally wanted Edsel to have to walk to work every day and pass this fucking hole to be reminded of what a bad decision that was.
Yep.
I'm like, weird. So, all right. And this is where things, but wait, Matt, there's more. 1935, the Wagner Act passed, and this allows workers to unionize. And this became a problem for automakers. And they really want, now Ford hated unions. He hated them because they challenged his power.
What do you mean you're going
to tell me how to do it? Yeah.
I mean,
so
when you have, I don't know how many employees at that time, right? But they have tens of thousands of employees. He felt like, now I can't do what I want to do. The union all of a sudden runs my whole company, and they can do whatever they want, dictate or strike at any time. If they won't do things how I want them to do them, screw that.
So this was UAW, United Auto Workers, and they put a lot of pressure. They were having strikes, and I mean, things got violent.
Yeah, GM and Chrysler unionized pretty quick, but then Ford fought it till the very end.
And he really did. Publicity from his union backlash, coupled with their lack of innovation, caused him to lose share again. So, at this point, Ford is aging. And he's becoming combative. He's paranoid. He's getting senile, and and World War II breaks out. Now, Ford gained some big government defense contracts and put the company back on track, but the government was really concerned that they weren't going to be able to build what they wanted to build. Like, Ford was just stubborn. He was a turd. And, with the union continuing, the union problems were continuing, and Edsel works out an agreement without Henry, which, by the way, Henry refused to sign. And in the end, Ford ends up giving UAW, Henry Ford, everything they needed. But it wasn't out of anything other than the word on the street was his wife, Clara, was like, if you don't sign this, I'm out.
Ouch.
I'm out. He didn't even want to do
Yeah.
it. He didn't want to sign it. So anyway. So, we mentioned the pressure, the stress, the bullshit. That really, in the end, ended up weighing hard on Edsel, who in 1943 died of stomach cancer at age 49.
Yeah. And
you talk about control. At that time, Ford is literally showing up at the doctors demanding that they restore his health.
yeah, it makes you really wonder if all of Etzel's health problems had to do with stress and all that stuff from his father and everything else for many years before.
Well, they mentioned at that time, they mentioned that having stomach ulcers was not uncommon for the management there,
Mhm.
and that was just the shitty, stressful work environment. But so after Edsel died, Henry tried to take over, which was problematic again because at this point he's old.
Oh yeah,
He was senile.
he's 80.
He was totally problematic. Yeah, totally problematic.
He should have ran for president. He was like 78, give or take.
Yeah.
He should have ran for president.
Think about that. Yeah.
That's
So
what we say.
so finally in 1947, the dude dies at 83 years old. And it wasn't until at that point that the company finally went public.
Yes. But to this day, the Ford family actually still controls the whole company.
I believe it.
They have
I believe it.
They have like super voting shares that control everything.
Well, Henry Ford II was the CEO and in charge for a really long time. And, I don't know, that's a lot to deal with. So, yeah. And that was kind of where the show ended. Now, this is a longer one. Was about 2 hours long. It's loaded with a lot of historical and those kind of facts.
It was very interesting.
Overall, what'd you think?
I thought it was great. And, it definitely showed you, when we started, I said, oh, what did you know about Henry Ford before you watched this, right? And the only thing I knew is like, oh, he obviously started the Ford Motor Company and invented the Model T, which, I knew a little bit about assembly line. That's really all I knew. But it was really fascinating to learn all the stuff behind the scenes. And, I think it's kind of a typical story, actually, of somebody who is really smart, builds something, and kind of gets a little, further than he can manage, right? And then on the other side, becomes so egotistical about what he built that everybody else catches up to him and passes him, which is really what happened. He stopped innovating.
Not only one, it happened a couple of times.
Yeah. And so, these are typical stories that they even happen today. You get the people that build these things and they think they're built the best thing in the world, and somebody else comes right behind them and does something even better and passes them by.
I think the thing I took away from this is obviously like you got to accept that things will change and improve. If you can't do it all yourself, then you rely on others more than yourself, and you got to respect the hustle, man. Like the whole act of just like trying to control, like it was kind of a shitty place to work, even though they ended up paying people more at one point. The question is at what price? I hate the whole hater stuff. Like I don't have to like someone to do business with them, but I need you to not be like a racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic asshole.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to give you my money if you're out spouting that shit.
Yep.
Like, ain't no one got time for that. And that's the thing that annoys me with some people. And sometimes it's on the other side of things. And this, like when we would go to a lot of concerts and live events. And I hate it when the artist like stops and it's like, I just want to take a couple minutes and talk to you about my personal views about politics and this shit. And I'm like, fuck you. Let's talk more rock. I know. Play music. I didn't come here to join your political rally. And that was, I mean, that was, the same kind of thing. And I think if we're going to learn something from all this is that your personal views you shouldn't be like you shouldn't be half an oppressor
Yeah.
when it comes to that. And I always say I want to avoid discussing ever talking of politics, religion, or sex in the workplace because none of them have an upside.
Yeah. Yeah, he was
And I
definitely
think
very
that would have been all
oppressive,
right.
very oppressive to all his employees and everybody about his own lifestyle choices and all that stuff. It was really crazy.
So how many popcorn buckets are you out on this one?
Out of 5?
Yeah, I think you invented the
Yeah.
popcorn bucket system in the
Um,
last one.
I'm gonna go with 4. I'm gonna go with 4.
I'm gonna go with 4 too. Yeah, I'm gonna go with 4. I think that it could have possibly been a 4.5. I think there were a few spots that were a little slow, but if you're a history buff and you like the details and the expansion of the details, then this is for you. I mean, because like I said, it depends. Like my wife wouldn't have enjoyed this because it was a little long.
I actually never really found it very boring. I think there was just a lot of continual kind of twists and turns in the crazy shit that he did that made it really interesting.
Yeah, and I enjoyed that part of it. And I like the historical details. I didn't mind the length. I'm saying overall, like my popcorn bucket ratings are based on what I think our listeners would feel about it.
Or is
And
it
I
based
think
on how
that
much popcorn you actually ate?
I'm on keto diet right now, so that would be 0 buckets.
Mm.
Yeah. So, but the point is like like I think this I think that this is kind of a must watch for entrepreneurs and future entrepreneurs because there's a lot of lessons to be taken from this, especially when it comes to a lot of things to avoid. And the fact that Ford has continued to grow into such a behemoth and like, they're not in their finest years right now, but they're there. Still a big ass company doing a lot of stuff, a lot of value, a lot of wealth, a lot of stuff, a lot of things. Some of the things we didn't even get into was the car, the access to the car and people buying the car changed consumerism and
Yeah,
everything.
I mentioned that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and it just changed that whole thing, which is also something Ford grew to hate.
Yeah.
Like, look at this amazing thing that I have built that is causing things to grow and get better, but I'm going to hate all of it. So I think in the end, the thing I took from this is don't be a dick. Like, is that fair enough to say?
I
Like,
like to think that
it's
most of
not
us,
a bad rule to live
but I
by.
think most of us learned that in like kindergarten.
Yeah, I mean, well, some of us do, and then
Yeah.
some of us are way better at it than others. And it's just I don't know. So in the end, man, another successful movie night. So the next one is available on Netflix. It's much newer. It's called American Factory.
Okay.
Have you seen that yet?
I don't know. What's that one about?
It's an interesting story. I'm not going to give too much of it away because it is very much on Netflix. It came out, I believe, last year, if not 2018. Won a bunch of awards. It's about a Japanese company coming in and kind of re-innovates a struggling factory somewhere in like Ohio or whatever. And like I said, it's a bit of an award winner.
Okay.
And like I said, I thought it was a good. I'm trying to kind of line these up so they kind of make sense going into each other because we looked at Ford and now American Factory. So, there's been so many changes and the auto industry is still in a massive state of transition and trying to
Big
catch
time.
up with stuff. Yeah, and you look at and so how is that changing stuff? People sometimes ask, they're like, why did these car makers or why are certain like they say Sony's trying to make an electric car? That's because cars don't have fuel combustion. The future car doesn't have a combustion engine in it.
Dude,
So
our cars really
what are you
shouldn't
good at?
be any different than the Power Wheels that our kids have for like $200.
Yeah, yeah, we're getting there. We go.
Really
That's what
not
we're
any
gonna do.
different.
We need to try to invent a $500 quadricycle
Yeah.
that's good for anybody.
Yes, with reverse.
I'm gonna get after that. I'll see you
See ya.
next time.